Hello, I'm Eric O'Dell with CA's Continuous Testing Live, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague Steve Feloney, who's the Vice President for Continuous Delivery here at CA Technologies. Now, Steve, we've been talking a lot lately about some of the sweeping changes that have been occurring within the world of continuous testing. And by sweeping changes, we're talking about some of the things that we've seen with Gartner's Magic Quadrant for software test automation. I was wanting to know if you could tell us a little bit about what you've been seeing in that quadrant.
When you talk about sweeping changes, I wouldn't just say sweeping changes in continuous testing. It's sweeping changes across the testing landscape is what we've been seeing. And these have been going on for a few years. But when you talk about the quadrant, we've seen a change this year in how Gartner graded the quadrant, or how they looked at the individual customers they put in the quadrant, right? They changed the criteria. So what's nice is because of the changes that have been going on, because you have more shift left, you have developers that need different types of tools and different types of needs, and the demands are now, as you were mentioning, across continuous testing. So the criteria has changed for the quadrant and who gets in and how all that works, because Gartner has seen that these changes are now important and that more and more enterprises are now asking for these new capabilities.
So as you take a look at the quadrant itself, you see that a number of vendors have moved out of the leadership quadrant, a number of other vendors have moved out of the visionary, and they've gone over to the challenger side of things. So what is causing that? What do you attribute that to?
Well, again, it's to the shift in how Gartner, the criteria that Gartner is using for the quadrant. So because the criteria has changed, a lot of these vendors that might have been in the leaders quadrant or in the visionary quadrant get shifted because they don't have either. They don't solve the issues that they're looking for in the criteria, such as the continuous testing, API testing, open source, and things of that nature, or it's because the consumers, the enterprise customers, are not choosing them as often, and so therefore that's causing a shift, because you'd see that shift as the enterprises want these new features, they're not choosing these other vendors anymore, so that's another reason for the shift.
All right, now there's another report that Gartner issued just about a month ago called the Gartner Critical Capabilities Report for Software Test Automation. What's the difference between that report and what we see in the Magic Quadrant?
Well, they're actually complementary to each other. So the Magic Quadrant comes out, it shows different types of things for the vendors, really how much revenue the vendors are making, plus meeting these certain critical capabilities that you mentioned, plus how happy the enterprise customers are with them, and so on, right? And they're also looking at thought leadership. Where are they in the thought leadership? So there's different things, but complementary to that are the critical capabilities. What is really important when it comes down to automated testing now? And those critical capabilities have shifted from one year to the other, but that's what those are. They're actually very complementary to each other. Now, if you are interested in something very specific, say you're interested in API testing,
right,
or say you're very interested in continuous testing, you look into that critical capabilities report, and then you can see what vendors you would want to go with based on those critical capabilities. The quadrant is, I don't want to say generic, but it's a little bit more genericized, so all those capabilities are in there. And so, but if you want something specific, you would use the critical capabilities as a complement to the Magic Quadrant.
Right, and so when we take a look at the critical capabilities report compared to last year, we've seen a number of changes that have occurred where they've consolidated some of the use cases and they've added some use cases. Tell us what's happened in that critical capabilities report.
Yeah, so with the change in testing, as we talked about, change in automation testing, the shift, continuous testing, Gartner has changed some of those critical capabilities. Now, last year, there was a focus on browsers and mobile and packaged applications. That's all still there, but that's been merged into one critical capability. So taking down the priorities, if you will, of those individuals. Still there, but it's been consolidated, as you said. What's been added is they've added continuous testing, because continuous testing is now something that enterprises, not just your unicorns, are trying to achieve, but your full enterprises are trying to achieve continuous testing across the entire life cycle. It's the next evolution with DevOps. And so they've added that as a critical capability. API testing is still there as a critical capability, and they've added open source. Again, you have to think about the shift left. Right? When you have that shift left, I said shift left, right. But when you do the shift left, you have developers. What do developers want? Developers are trying to use more open source technologies. They don't want to talk with vendors right away. They don't want to have to go through a big sales cycle. They want to get access to it, and they don't want to believe that they're locked in, or they don't want to be locked in. So open source gives them a lot of flexibility. And so vendors now have to start to utilize or accept this open source if they want to move forward in the testing venues, because that's what developers want and agile testing teams want. And so that's another critical capability that's been added.
Continuous testing comes out of nowhere, and now it's one of the key criteria for the critical capabilities report. Why has that come about?
All right, so it seems to have come out of nowhere from the Gartner critical capabilities in the Magic Quadrant. It hasn't really come out of nowhere. It just takes time for Gartner to add that to their quadrants and their critical capabilities, because they have to see a level of full acceptance from the enterprises before they add it. So continuous testing has been going on for a few years now, but now that it's reached a certain critical mass point, now we're seeing that brought into the quadrant, which rightly so.
Right. So if you take a look at what we have here on the screen, we have the scores for continuous testing. And you know, last year's CA Technologies wasn't in the critical capabilities report for software test automation.
Correct.
Suddenly you see CA Technologies, and wow, we're at the top here for continuous testing. What has happened in this last year that has caused CA to rise to the top of this?
Well, CA is awesome, so that's really what it is. But it's really that whole shift in the focus of what it means to have the right capabilities for software automation. That's really what's caused the change. So as you mentioned, last year we were not in the Magic Quadrant. Last year we were not in the critical capabilities. But because of the shift, because of the change in what Gartner is now focusing on for the critical capabilities for software automation, we were now able to be part of the quadrant and the critical capabilities. Now, when you look at the critical capabilities, one of the big critical capabilities, as you're saying, is continuous testing. Now, when Gartner looks at and scores all the different aspects that they're looking at for that continuous testing, we got the highest score. CA got the highest score. And so with that, you're now seeing us in a leadership position, which is very good for us. It's not saying that we didn't have these capabilities before. We've had them, and we've been enhancing them year after year. It's just now Gartner is starting to use that as one of their critical capabilities for software automation, because the enterprises have reached that critical mass point where it's now appropriate to be adding it.
So a lot of the leaders, folks like HPE, Micro Focus now, you know, they were at the top in like 4 different categories for the critical capabilities, but we're not seeing them at the top of this. What do you attribute that to?
Well, again, it's the shift. So you look at legacy software versus newer software. When you look at HPE is very good for what they do, right? And they've been doing that for years. So they're very good at that. They've been in the leadership quadrant. They've been there for a long time. But now with the change, it's almost like a changing of the guard. With the change of what's needed for automated testing, HPE's just not there. They're just not keeping up. They're doing their old thing, and they're very good at it. But when it comes to continuous testing, they haven't put the features, the functions, the tools in place to really help out with that continuous testing as much. And that's why you're not seeing them as high on the board as one might have expected based on last year. But it's the same thing when you look at API testing. It's the same thing when you look at open source. It's the same thing when you look at all these critical capabilities. Micro Focus now is down lower.
Yeah, can you switch to the next screen there? And let's take a look at the API test. What do you see here?
Well, again, I see that CA is awesome. That's what I see. So again, CA has the highest score when it comes to API testing. Now, that is for a few things. One, there's the basics of API testing that many of these vendors support, and that's perfectly fine. But then you have to look at what are the differentiations that CA might be doing to get that highest area versus what others are doing. Because people are so used to hearing API testing. One of the things that we do is we auto-generate these tests, right? Auto-generate. That's key. Now, when it comes to continuous testing, you need to auto-generate tests and auto-maintain tests, because how else are you going to do continuous testing if you don't do that correctly? Right? Because if you have to keep manually creating the test, manually maintaining the test, you're slowing down. So auto-generation. So one of the things that we do for our API testing is we auto-generate the test. Positive, negative, edge case, SQL injection. Yes, SQL injection. No one else is doing that. So that gives us an edge. over our API testing. And we also offer API testing as a SaaS service. We also offer API testing as an on-prem service.
All right, so we've talked about how CA is taking the leadership in continuous testing and also in API web service testing. So talk to the DevOps professionals who may be watching this video.
They should be watching this video.
Well, they should be watching it because of you, but, but how should they use this critical capabilities report?
Well, they use it like any other report that they're looking at. It depends on what their needs are. Are they trying to achieve continuous testing? Right? Use that report. Use the Magic Quadrant. See who's the visionary, who's the thought leadership, who's doing what they need now, who's doing what they need in the future, for the future, right? Because you want to be future-proof, right, as you're doing these things. So you look at the report and see what your needs are, and then you base it on that, and then you bring the vendors in, you do your looking, and you see which one is doing what you expect them to do.
Right. So speaking of future-proof and visionaries, what can our viewers expect from CA when it comes to continuous testing in the future?
One of the things that you'll be seeing from us in the future is not everything's going to be on-prem. We're doing a lot of SaaS. We're going to see continuous testing SaaS, right? So you've seen with BlazeMeter where we have performance testing and API functional testing as SaaS. Our CDD, which is our orchestration and visualization and tracking of your releases. You see that. We have an on-prem and we have a SaaS offering. You're going to soon see our service virtualization be a SaaS offering. So we're going to be connecting all this so you can do continuous testing in the cloud, continuous testing as a service. So you'll see that moving forward. And then as we see other changes that go on with the needs and demands of testers and developers, like one of the things I mentioned earlier was automating the automation. You will see more of that coming from us. We want to help you auto-maintain your scripts, because if you can't auto-create and auto-maintain your scripts, it's really hard to fully achieve continuous testing.
All right. Well, Steve, thank you very much for all this insight and analysis on the Gartner Critical Capabilities Report and about continuous testing. And we want to thank you for joining us here on Continuous Testing Live.